that they want to impose this on us, because they are the ones who set the rules. Very well. We have decided to take responsibility for ourselves.
Burkina Faso just handed out 50,000 brand new homes completely free to those uprooted by chaos. If this shocks you, then you are not ready for what we are about to discuss in this video. So, how does a nation in turmoil transform despair into a daring act of nation building? Let's find out. It didn't start with speeches or ceremonies. It started with silence, broken only by the sounds of hammers hitting bricks in a stretch of land that had been forgotten. There were no grand political announcements, no ribbon cuttings, no press conferences. Just men, women, and machines laying down the skeleton of something that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. A new beginning. To understand why Captain Ibrahim Traore chose housing, not weapons, not infrastructure, not flashy mega projects, as the first battlefield of his revolution, you have to go back to the dust. Not metaphorical dust, the real kind. The dry, clinging, soul-erasing dust of abandoned villages, burned homes, and refugee camps scattered across northern and central Burkina Faso. Places where children had stopped asking about school, and adults had stopped imagining what normal looked like. These weren't just displaced people. These were people displaced from the idea of a future. The country had been ripped apart by insurgent violence for almost a decade. Towns emptied, markets turned to ash. The state retreated and left a vacuum, one filled with insurgents, fear, and silence. And when aid came, it wasn't much more than a plastic tarp and a ration card. No dignity, no structure, no future. People weren't just unhoused, they were invisible. Traore understood this better than most, not as a general reading reports, but as a soldier who'd walked through those ghost towns. He knew the fight for Burkina Faso wasn't just in the forests or at the borders. It was in the minds of people who had nothing left to believe in. If the state couldn't protect them before, could it now convince them it still cared? That's why the order came, not to mobilize tanks, but to mobilize cement. But this wasn't a housing project in the conventional sense. It wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was a psychological operation disguised as urban planning. Traore wasn't just rebuilding homes. He was rebuilding faith. In a country where the government had long been seen as either corrupt or absent, offering not just homes but entire neighborhoods, fully powered, fully plumbed, fully livable, was like handing someone a passport back into citizenship. And here's what made it radical. No rent, no mortgage, no catch. These homes weren't gifts. They were declarations. They said, you belong here. This is your land. This country has not abandoned you. It was a silent revolution, but not one without intent. The layout of the new city was strategic. It included schools, clinics, green spaces, and community centers. It wasn't about resettlement. It was about permanence, about saying, you won't be moved again. It was about turning IDPs, internally displaced persons, into rooted citizens again. And Traore didn't outsource this mission. He didn't call in foreign contractors or allow it to become another debt-trap infrastructure project. He turned to local labor, architects, engineers, masons, and electricians, all Burkinabe. Even the materials were sourced locally. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The people building the homes were building their future, brick by brick. The state wasn't the savior. The state was the scaffolding. The people were the builders. Critics called it unsustainable. Western analysts scoffed at the cost. But something far more valuable than profit was being generated: stability. As homes went up, gunfire in nearby regions slowed. As communities were reassembled, militia recruitment declined. When you give people four walls and a front door, you also give them something to defend and less reason to run. But beneath this calm, another need emerged. When the first families moved into their homes, they weren't just asking for safety. They began asking, where will we work? A house is a foundation, but a life still needs income, purpose, and food. As walls rose and roofs were laid, a new question echoed across the construction sites and empty streets. What good is a home if there's no livelihood to go with it? And that's exactly where Traore turned next. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. But here's the genius of it. Traore didn't import the solution. He turned to the very people who built the city. Masons, plumbers, carpenters, and electricians, trained and employed during the housing boom, were now the engine for an entirely new economic model. Instead of disbanding the construction crews after the last roof was tiled, he redirected their labor into permanent trades. Mobile repair units, housing maintenance cooperatives, and technical service centers were born right next to the neighborhoods they had helped build. This was a quiet but revolutionary shift. In most post-crisis environments, jobs are either outsourced to NGOs or swallowed by the informal economy. Traore flipped that dynamic. He nationalized the skills. The very process of rebuilding became the bedrock of a new domestic workforce. What started as housing evolved into a self-contained job creation machine. Even more radical was the financial model. The state didn't just pay workers, they invested in them. Through small state-backed grants and zero-interest loans, former laborers were encouraged to launch their micro-enterprises. Welders formed collectives. Builders started their carpentry workshops. Women who cooked meals for the construction teams began catering services and small restaurants. The economy was no longer something imported through foreign contracts. It was growing organically from the soil of self-reliance. And it wasn't limited to city builders. Seeing the potential, the administration expanded vocational training to rural regions, where young people had often been easy prey for insurgency recruiters. Instead of waiting for job announcements, villagers began receiving toolkits and short-term training on electrical wiring, brickmaking, and basic engineering. Construction was now an entry point, not just into employment, but into nation building. But it wasn't just tradespeople benefiting. Traore realized that a functioning economy needed more than hands. It needed systems. He launched a series of local procurement policies requiring state projects to source materials from Burkina Faso suppliers. Cement, steel, timber, solar panels, even paint had to come from local producers whenever possible. This forced a dormant private sector to reawaken. Small businesses that had been stagnant under years of instability now had reason to expand, hire, and invest. The flow of money stayed within borders, and the multiplier effect was immediate. Salaries spent on groceries encouraged farming. Spending on home upgrades drove demand for new tools. The web of microeconomic transactions began to knit together a fragile but growing financial ecosystem. People weren't just surviving anymore. They were transacting. They were imagining. They were investing. Even the education system began to shift. The government reformed technical schools to align with these new national industries. No longer were students being prepared to become bureaucrats or to emigrate. They were being trained to wire homes, lay solar grids, repair machines, and design infrastructure. A new generation of professionals wasn't looking abroad. They were looking around and seeing opportunity. Still, with money flowing, businesses budding, and skills rising, another vulnerability emerged: dependency on imported food and energy. A city can't thrive on jobs alone if its stomach is empty. As Traore's team reviewed supply chains, they faced a cold truth. Even with jobs and homes, Burkina Faso was still dangerously dependent on foreign food, fuel, and fertilizers. It was time for the next front in this revolution, one that reached far beyond the cities and into the fields. If houses sparked labor and labor sparked income, then what could spark complete independence? The answer: food. Every revolution reaches a moment where it either feeds its people or fails them. Traore knew this. The new home stood strong. The economy, once paralyzed, was cautiously moving. But as life slowly returned to the streets and cash began to circulate, a harder truth surfaced. Almost everything on Burkina Faso plates was imported. From rice in the markets to the bread on breakfast tables, foreign ships still decided whether citizens ate or starved. And that meant even with jobs and homes, the nation remained vulnerable. A border closure, a conflict in the supply chain, or a diplomatic breakdown with a food exporter could collapse everything Traore had just built. A country cannot truly rebuild if its stomach is still chained to a dock in Europe or Asia. That's when Traore made his next move, not with soldiers, but with seeds. He didn't issue a declaration. He launched a campaign, a massive, coordinated, state-led agricultural offensive. The term wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. Farms were no longer seen as rural relics. They were frontline assets in the battle for sovereignty. Every hectare reclaimed from neglect was a weapon. Every ton of rice grown locally was a diplomatic shield. And every young Burkinabe trained in sustainable farming was a soldier in the quiet war against hunger and dependence. Traore's vision was not to turn Burkina Faso into a subsistence farming relic of the past. This was industrial-scale agriculture, guided by intelligence, powered by innovation, and rooted in national purpose. Fields were mapped, water systems repaired, and farming cooperatives equipped with modern tools, storage units, and transportation links. Solar-powered irrigation was installed in regions long abandoned by the central government. The goal wasn't just to grow crops. It was to make agriculture profitable, permanent, and patriotic. He started with staples: millet, sorghum, rice, and maize, prioritizing crops that fed the masses. The state subsidized seeds and fertilizers, not through foreign NGO channels, but directly through local agricultural centers that were quickly revamped into logistics hubs. But Traore didn't stop there. He wanted Burkina Faso not only to feed itself, but to feed others. That meant thinking beyond survival, into exports. Pilot programs for high-value crops like cotton, sesame, and cashew were launched, linked directly to government-backed trading agreements with regional allies. These weren't raw exports meant to be shipped and processed abroad. Traore was already working behind the scenes to build domestic agro-processing plants, factories that would turn cashews into packaged goods, cotton into textiles, and sesame into oil. Not just food, but finished products. Not just crops, but industries. To fuel this agricultural engine, Traore did something almost unheard of in recent West African policy. He reformed land ownership laws. He pushed for legal recognition of rural landholders, especially women, who form the backbone of agricultural labor. For years, land titles had been unclear, overlapping, and easily stolen by elites or speculators. Traore's reform gave small farmers legal power, securing the very soil beneath their feet. That one move transformed farmers into investors, no longer afraid to improve land they could lose. And as fields flourished, so did morale. Soldiers once tasked with chasing militants in the bush were now helping deliver fertilizer to remote farms. Former IDPs returned not only to their houses but to their harvests. School meals began using locally grown food. The military provided logistics. The youth provided labor. The government provided strategy. It was a full-spectrum campaign. The offensive wasn't just agricultural. It was emotional, economic, and national. The results came quickly. Within 2 years, Burkina Faso had slashed rice imports, boosted grain yields by double digits, and created thousands of seasonal and permanent farming jobs. GDP growth, once stuck in the mud of instability, surged past 5%. And more importantly, the country's food security index, a dry, technical measure, began to reflect something deeper. A people reconnected to their land, not by folklore, but by function. But with growth came another looming question. Who controls the profits? Traore had reconnected the people to the land, yes. But he also knew that Burkina Faso's real wealth, its gold, its minerals, its energy, was still slipping through the cracks of foreign contracts and colonial-era concessions. Agriculture has given people strength. Now he needed to protect that strength from being sold off again. If seeds had sparked pride, it was time for gold to spark power. And that meant facing down the last empire still lurking, the economy. By the time Burkina Faso was growing its food and housing its people, a quiet shift had begun. Confidence was returning, not just to the streets or the schools, but to the minds of the people. For the first time in decades, Burkinabe citizens were no longer waiting for foreign rescue. They were building, planting, and producing. But beneath that surface victory, something darker still lingered. Something buried deeper than the roots of millet, or the foundation of a new home. Gold. Burkina Faso is one of the largest gold producers in Africa. Yet, like many of its neighbors, the wealth had rarely stayed within its borders. Contracts signed in French boardrooms decades ago still dictate who got rich. Foreign companies operated the mines, exported the bullion, and left behind environmental scars, disfigured communities, and a pittance in royalties. For years, the gold sector wasn't an asset. It was an open wound, leaking national wealth into foreign vaults. And that's where Ibrahim Traore turned next. Fresh off the success of his agricultural revolution, Traore knew sovereignty was not just about feeding or housing the people, it was about ownership. Who owns the wealth beneath the soil? Who decides the value of what Burkina Faso produces? Who controls the terms? That's why, in one of his most audacious moves yet, Traore launched a full-scale reclamation of the country's mining sector. It didn't start with headlines or threats, it started with audits, quiet inspections of foreign-run mines, legal reviews of outdated contracts, a sudden push for transparency and revenue flows. And then, just as the mining companies began to notice the temperature rising, the first major move was made. $80 million worth of national gold reserves were seized. The message was unmistakable. The age of passive extraction was over. But Traore didn't stop there. He ordered the establishment of a domestic gold refinery, operated not by some multinational conglomerate, but by the Burkina Faso state itself. For decades, the country had been exporting raw gold and importing finished products at ridiculous markups. Now the processing would happen at home, jobs would stay local, taxes would feed the budget, and the value chain, long broken, would finally be repaired. The creation of the refinery was more than an economic decision. It was symbolic. It said, Burkina Faso no longer ships its future away in the form of unprocessed ore. It molds it, shapes it, keeps it. The refinery became a monument to something deeper than profit, dignity. Still, Traore knew symbolism alone couldn't break the system. That's why his administration began rewriting the rules of engagement. All new mining contracts had to include higher royalties, mandatory local hiring quotas, and environmental responsibility clauses. Informal miners, once criminalized and hunted, were brought into state-run cooperatives. With ID cards, safety gear, and access to markets, they went from being exploited laborers to formal contributors to the national economy. For decades, Burkina Faso's gold had also been a magnet for destabilization. Insurgent groups operated in mining regions, taxing smuggling routes and intimidating locals. But with the state now present and the profits redirected, the terrain changed. Mines became secure zones. Military patrols protected workers, not corporate interests. And the communities around the mines saw something they had never seen before: revenue sharing, new roads, clinics, electricity. Traore had found a way to weaponize gold not for war, but for sovereignty. Critics in the West called it resource nationalism. But Traore didn't flinch. He publicly challenged the legitimacy of colonial-era contracts and demanded that African countries stop behaving like raw resource warehouses for industrialized nations. Burkina Faso's wealth, he argued, should be a foundation for industrialization, not a bargaining chip in foreign policy. It's this mindset that started rippling beyond borders. Mali and Niger took notice. Guinea and Chad sent delegations. A quiet bloc was forming. Leaders who were no longer content with GDP statistics that looked good on paper while people lived in poverty. They were talking about refining at home, manufacturing at home, and taxing at home. And yet, even as Traore tightened his grip on the gold sector, he understood that reclaiming wealth wasn't enough. Ownership means nothing if you lack protection. All the houses, farms, and factories he had helped build could crumble overnight if one thing failed: defending it. And that's why his next move was not economic, but geopolitical. Burkina Faso had homes. It had jobs. It had food. It was reclaiming its gold, its economy, and its dignity. But as these foundations were laid, another reality began to surface, one far more dangerous than insurgents or inflation. The real threat wasn't internal, it was the world watching. Because when a small landlocked nation begins to reject aid, tax the powerful, and talk about self-reliance, eyebrows rise in Paris, whispers stir in Washington, and silence falls over international institutions. Traore wasn't just building a new Burkina Faso. He was disrupting a system, one where African nations are expected to remain dependent, fractured, and in need. But now, the old players were being denied the front row seat. They could no longer pull strings, and that made Burkina Faso a problem. So Traore did something rare in modern African politics. He leaned into isolation. Instead of negotiating back into favor with Western powers, he made a sharp turn. On January 28, 2024, Burkina Faso, along with Mali and Niger, jointly announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS, the West African regional bloc heavily influenced by external donors, and, many believe, by France. This wasn't just a political divorce, it was the start of a new allegiance, one built not on foreign alignment, but on shared struggle, mutual defense, and ideological clarity. These nations weren't just bound by coups, they were bound by a shared refusal to remain clients of old empires. Traore called it restoring historical truth, a reference to the Pan-African legacy of leaders like Thomas Sankara, who believed that freedom without economic independence was a myth. But this new axis, what many now call the Sahel Coalition, wasn't just philosophical, it was strategic. Joint military operations were launched, intelligence-sharing protocols were signed, airspace and borders became coordinated zones. Together, these nations began building a defensive wall, not against their neighbors, but against interference, against drone strikes without permission, against mining contracts signed without consent, against foreign bases disguised as security partnerships. And when Traore looked beyond the continent, he didn't look to the IMF, he looked east. Partnerships with Russia were announced, military training, arms deals, and equipment deliveries. Then came agreements with Turkey and Iran for drones and surveillance systems. Traore wasn't just buying weapons, he was replacing dependency with diversification. For every Western route cut off, a new one was opened with countries that didn't demand lectures in exchange for cooperation. But even in this pivot, Traore remained careful. He didn't want a new master, just new terms. His rhetoric was clear. Burkina Faso would not trade one empire for another. It would work with partners, not patrons. And in doing so, he challenged the very logic of global diplomacy that treats small African states as chess pieces, not players. The West responded the only way it knows how, with warnings. Sanctions were floated, aid was frozen. Think tanks labeled him authoritarian. But to many Burkinabe citizens, the only thing they saw was a leader who didn't blink, who told the truth as it was, who said, "We will suffer for our freedom if we must, but we will no longer be slaves in silence." Inside Burkina Faso, this boldness did something unusual. It united people, not just around a man, but around a mission. From students in Ouagadougou to farmers in Kaya, there was a new kind of national consciousness. It wasn't about slogans or military uniforms. It was about control of land, of wealth, of decisions. For the first time in decades, people felt that their country had chosen a path not charted by colonial maps or aid agencies, but by them. But do you think this change will last? Will other nations join? Let us know in the comment section. Are you happy to see Burkina Faso changing? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
If Africans does not take care of themselves and their continent, nobody will. Their purpose and aims towards Africa is just for us to remain where we are, being stagnant, while they are flourishing in any ramifications all the days of their lives. Kudos for the bold steps taken by Ibrahim Traore. Like I always say, how I wish other African leaders can rally around him and see the need to unify all African countries. Come together to a round table. What do you have that I don't have? How do we collaborate? How do we trade? How do we exchange? How do we make things work for Africa, by Africa, and with Africa? I believe if all these are being discussed on a regular basis, things will always work out good for Africans. The division, the seed of discord being sown into us by our colonial masters has been that issue on trust that have been bedeviling the development of Africa by African leaders. A continent that is so blessed, that's supposed to have borderless, one currency, one voice. But today, trust has been an issue that so many leaders are finding it difficult to erase from their heart. Anyway, whatever you think, drop your comment in the comment section. Once again, share and follow the page. And for the record, congratulations to Ibrahim Traore. Share this video and let's circulate it around the world. Never again should we allow them to circulate any negative news about Africa when we have good ones that will put them to where they belong, that we can defend ourselves, feed ourselves, liberate ourselves from the shackles of those who do not want us to move forward.